Quickly, I would like us to acknowledge the traditional and ancestral territories of the Mississaugas of the New Credit, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Huron-Wendat, who are the original owners and custodians of the land on which we stand. I think it's important in this context of the end of the world to think about land. It's interesting on this island. It's interesting in this city where we don't often necessarily think about land in the same way as we might when we're outside of the city. And think about how we share the land and what's happening on the land. I also think in the context of this lecture series, it would be good for us to think a little bit about what is the world? What does the end of the world mean? Wanda Nandabush talked about how she felt like the world had already ended twice. So what is an end, and is it a good thing or bad thing? And then also I love lectures because then I kind of space out on my own dialogues for my own really specific interests. So I think it'd be interesting for everyone to ask themselves, what would you say if it was the last lecture that you were going to give at the end of the world? I love how I look so hard for my notes, and now I'm just really nice. I want to thank a few people that have been great. So the Art Spin people have been really amazing. Also, it's been fun to have the music with the Small World Music Festival. And our team has been great. We've worked, it's like we haven't had a day off forever because we're working weekends, it feels like. So Linda Columbus and Khadijah Morley, thank you for doing it with us, or for being us, I guess. And sort of laughing at myself. This program is part of a series of off-site programming that Onsite Gallery is doing while we build our new space, which opens on June 21st, 2017. So please look out for our off-site programming, and I know the world in one form or another will last long enough for us to celebrate in our new space. Really happy to have Rouzbeh Akhbari with us today. Rouzbeh is an Iranian installation and video artist based in Toronto. He's actually been involved with Onsite for a long time, so it's sort of funny to be reading his bio, but that's what I'm going to do. His practice is research-driven, often interventionist, often with an interventionist approach, and situated within the interdisciplinary intersection of post-colonial theory, political economies, and critical architecture. His ongoing research engages the global socio-political conundrums that translate into architectures of conflict, defense urbanisms, and the semiotics of imperial-built forms. Rouzbeh has exhibited projects at La Fabrique Culturelle des Abattoirs in Casablanca, Birch Contemporary in Toronto, 7-Eleven in Toronto, and the Museum of Nanjing University in China. Yes. He is currently an MVS Fellow at University of Toronto School of Architecture, Landscape and Design. So welcome, Rouzbeh.
Thank you. Hello everyone, thank you for the lovely introductions, and thank you all for being here today. I'm really excited to be here and also honored to be part of the lecture series that has been quite radically programmed, and I think really incredible people have been talking in it as well. Also thank you for the acknowledgement of the true custodians of the land that we're standing on, and I'm really glad that the whole lecture series was started by Wanda Nandabush's talk about the acknowledgement and understanding the world from that perspective. So the reason I'm here today is because a few months ago, Lisa, representing Onsite Gallery, approached me to talk about the end of the world, and specifically asked me to talk within the kind of subtitle of post-Anthropocenes. And I mean, it's a term that I'm really fascinated with because the Anthropocene itself is something that kind of came out quite recently. And to imagine a world that is already after our understanding of the Anthropocene was just really fascinating. So today I'm here to talk about Anthropocene and possibly imagine the fabrication of worlds and their kind of collapse that is often simultaneous from the perspective of kind of water infrastructure and understanding it as kind of a defense kind of mechanism of built forms. I'm pretty sure a lot of you know the kind of history of the Anthropocene and the etymology and the specifics of it a lot better than I do, but it's a term that Paul Crutzen, he didn't necessarily coin it, but he started using it more often as a way of referring to an epoch where human activity and interaction with landscapes became the dominant kind of force of reshaping and kind of influencing how land use and Earth's ecology in general is defined. So, and I feel like within the past few years, the term Anthropocene is kind of thrown around in many different disciplines, like geography or anthropology, and all these interdisciplinary kind of nexuses. But it's also something that we keep thinking about as a form that is constantly redefining itself. And I mentioned earlier that I'll be talking about water, and it's mainly because I've been thinking a lot about it these days. And water is something that is often part of kind of post-apocalyptic ways of thinking and narratives that usually end up kind of explaining the end of the world as some kind of flood that comes and kind of erases everything. And often the fabrication of worlds also depend on large bodies of water. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to keep the lecture quite casual and talk about three of the case studies that I've been involved with, some of them personal because of some teenager experiences that I had growing up in Iran, and the rest of them have to do with some of the work that I was doing this summer in the Ningxia province of China, which is kind of on the edges of the Gobi Desert. And lastly, I'm going to focus on the very kind of artificial island that we're standing on in Material Place, and kind of talking about the relationship between defense mechanisms and water infrastructure in general. And these three case studies, I'm going to present them in three different points in time as well. One of them is going to be the kind of early 1980s, and the next point in time would be 2003, and the last one that I'm going to wrap up with will be now. Historically, when you look at texts that are kind of narrativizing the beginning of civilizations around the world, most of them focus on some kind of body of water that is necessary for the cultural kind of for the growth of a populace and also the creation of cities and cultures and things like that. And often they refer to the Tigris and Euphrates as one of them. The Yellow River is also kind of a birth point for many different communities that end up building around the body of water that they have access to. And the last one is, of course, the Great Lakes that are kind of surrounding us right now with Lake Ontario. Often the relationship that mammals end up kind of creating with water is one of fear and necessity at the same time, because they really need the water to continue to produce their culture, but they also have this extreme fear of water when it's not contained or clean, because let's say if the water of a river that is constantly kind of flowing, you're using it for kind of your living, for livelihood, and then when there's a massive flood, you're dealing with this kind of unleashed force that could erase your world as you're imagining it. For humans, however, it's a little bit different, because that point of fear for a lot of architects and just people thinking about space creation becomes inspiration for redefining the landscape. So if they're noticing some kind of a threat to the cities that they're planted, they're immediately going to start thinking about some form of defensive mechanism to stop it. And my talk today will specifically focus on water, both as water infrastructure like dams and dikes and things like that, as forms of defensive architectural elements that are introduced to make sure water is always contained and civilizations kind of kept intact, and then understanding them as also weapons of war and offensive kind of strategies. I'm going to start with Tigris and Euphrates, because I'm kind of going through this chronologically, and that's the first time I was introduced and fascinated with water infrastructure. I think Lisa mentioned I grew up in Iran, and in high school we had to take this course. It was mandatory for everyone who's a 15-year-old. And the course was called Preparation for Defense. So it's kind of, it's a course that's designed by the Revolutionary Guard, and it's supposed to give you the introductions for any kind of military understanding that you need to have, either for joining the army, or even thinking beyond that, joining the architecture school run by the officers and things like that. On one of the chapters, I think it was chapter 8, and I was just reviewing the textbook before coming here because I find it so interesting. They give you an introduction of essentially using land elements as strategic points where you can either kind of face a new army or have to use them for offensive measures, essentially. And the narrative I'm going to tell you, this is the 1980s, so 1982, the Iran-Iraq war has already broken out, and there has been a lot of kind of conflicts around the south of Iran and the border with Iraq, around Basra. And right now, there has been a lot of narratives about these marshlands. We all know the history of how Saddam was kind of first dried up all of these marshlands, and the population had to get out because they were interested in developing really kind of cultivatable agricultural land that they could kind of use as cash crops. So they dried up the marshlands, and the population had to leave. But later on, it became kind of a political tool for him to continue to kind of oppress the people who were sometimes protesting against his power. So by the 80s, this has been going on for a while. Saddam, on the Iraqi side, and the Iranian government has constantly been putting up dams and dikes and introducing new irrigation canals in the region, mostly for agricultural purposes. But when the war broke out, this quite literally became a tool for a final offensive. So the Iranian government, really interested at the time of erasing as much population as they can, really have final offensive measures, started building these dams on the branches of Tigris that make their way into Iran. And most of them were using the rhetoric of, we need water, we need to kind of heat the water and irrigate it later on to different fields. But in 1983, the British were operating this reconnaissance kind of operation around the region, and they started noticing these kind of zigzag structures that are being placed for rediverting the river, and then starting to construct these massive dams, strategically placed in locations where the landscape could easily hold a large body of water, but also be able to unleash it whenever necessary. So it quite literally became kind of an architectural manifestation of an apocalyptic kind of vision for erasing Basra and all of its population. So the idea was that this narrative that we keep hearing, that there would be this massive flood for the end of the world, was in that case being followed quite literally for military purposes and strategic purposes, essentially. So now we know that in the 80s, like 1983, and the British journalists started kind of talking about this. London Observer was one of the first kind of news agencies that made this public, and there has been a lot of talk about it. And of course, it's completely insane. And the way I was introduced to this story was through the preparation for defense class. So on chapter 8, there is actually an example of how you can use landscape as a form of weapon, and that was one of the examples, which is kind of completely mind-blowing, casually talking about an end-of-the-world kind of scenario being proposed as a potential kind of weapon of war. And of course, it's not specific to that region. It has been going on in many different contexts, but I'm talking about that because it's what I've experienced as a 15-year-old, and it was just kind of mind-boggling at first. So we have all of this, so now we're kind of done with this case study in the 80s, and we're going to move to the work that I was doing in China this summer around the edges of the Gobi Desert. So in the 1980s, there has been a lot of villages kind of set up on the Lopanshan Mountains, which are in Ningxia province, a little bit south of the major city, which is Yinchuan. And people have been living there for hundreds of years. They have, most of their practice is herding, and they just have a lot of goats that they go around and graze. And it's a very kind of harsh landscape. It's kind of in the middle of the desert, but still there is enough vegetation for the goats to be able to feed off of it, and the small villages to form some kind of a community because they had enough water reservoirs under the ground that they could access. And you just continue looking at the creation of this new world for them because they've been there for quite some time, but they were originally exiled there because there were protesters 500 years ago against the kingdom, and the empire ends up exiling all of these people to these harsh lands where they were expected to die essentially, but they continued fabricating this new world for themselves. And they seem to be growing in a kind of steady pace for population, but then it continued, and the population starts growing more and more, so they start having water issues. What they end up doing is by the 90s, the poverty level over there was quite extreme because they didn't have enough water and vegetation was low, and they couldn't quite kind of make a business from what they were doing for hundreds of years. And on the other hand, the Gobi Desert, because of temperature changes or whatever it is that deserts move for, started expanding quite rapidly. So the desert is this kind of slow-moving, massive landscape that is slowly coming towards all of these urban kind of fabrics in larger cities, but it was very kind of directly felt in these villages that are very close to the desert. And the Chinese state's response originally, this started kind of in the 50s, was to introduce a massive tree planting initiative. So every summer, every spring, the Red Army shows up with trucks and a lot of trees, and they just essentially have volunteers, like millions of volunteers, who go around and plant these poplar trees and different kinds of shrubs around the edges. So the idea is to contain this extremely massive landscape, which is the size of many countries, slowly moving out towards the more central and more populated areas of the country. And these villages were kind of feeling it quite seriously. And what ends up kind of happening is the government decides that in order to stop the desert, you actually need a reason for doing that. And you can't just show up in trucks in the middle of the desert and start planting. So the idea for them was to introduce some kind of town or a city quite literally in the middle of the desert, so then they have a reason for defending it. So they start this new program, which they call the resettlement program of that whole region. And right now, if you look at the Western media, like The Guardian's China Apocalypse Office has a lot of articles about how this whole town was built because there were so many people influenced by desertification, and it's like a horrible place, and it's just really bad, and it keeps getting worse. But when you actually go there, it's, well, I'm calling it a town, but it's kind of a city of 500,000 people that were brought in. According to Chinese standards, it's kind of a town. But then they were brought in to this new space that they're creating called, the town is called Onsite. What's really interesting is a lot of these people are now a lot closer to the desert than they were originally, so they were kind of up in the mountains, kind of going on by doing their own business and accessing the water reservoirs. And now they're brought even closer to the desert, quite literally in the middle. And the way the town was built in the first place was they brought in 500, like the figure isn't exact, but around 500 bulldozers to flatten the dunes. So you're imagining this desert landscape, and then these bulldozers come in and flatten the dunes. There was massive investment in bringing the Yellow River over the mountains for 400 kilometers, and then introduce whatever crop that could potentially grow in this harsh condition and turn it into some kind of a town that could be sustainable. So the idea for them was to resettle all these people, and they called them desert refugees, but a lot of them were actually born there, so they're not, like the new generation are born there, so they're not necessarily refugees anymore, but they're just like living in this town that was created around 13 years ago. But the idea is that water in this case becomes the main reason for, the population is kind of brought over to this place where water is not, it's very scarce, but then the water was brought over as a way of defending against the expansion of the Gobi Desert. So the water infrastructure, the kind of irrigation canals that they had to produce to move the Yellow River for 400 kilometers becomes a way of rethinking the world that was already kind of fabricated in the first place as a way of sending people to die. So the world that they created was essentially from a world that was very close to an end. They were sent in exile there, and then their world was rethought and refabricated by entirely changing the landscape for another political reason, well, social as well, to defend against the expansion of the Gobi Desert. So that's the other case study. And the last one, I'm really interested in the islands that we're standing on and the kind of process that Ontario Place went through to be fabricated as a kind of a theme park. And some of you might be familiar with this narrative, but when Zeidler and his colleagues won the competition for making Ontario Place, their designs didn't include any of these islands. They were essentially more pods, like the hovering kind of structures over the water, and the geodesic dome. And the idea they were, the way they were contextualizing it was mostly kind of a dimensionless space that has a nod to the futuristic kind of understanding of space, and it had this kind of undertone of post-human thinking about the hydrosphere as this non-place almost that you can just exploit for having these structures onto it. And they won the competition, everything was good, but when it came to the actual construction phase, they realized the contractors told them that it would be a lot more expensive to make it that way because they needed so much more concrete to create the foundations to actually have these structures built on top of the water. So if you're thinking about having these structures just hovering on top of the water, especially in harsh conditions, like whenever you have a storm, you actually get pretty bad waves coming from the south. So what they ended up proposing to them, and to save around 90% of the budget, was to just bring in the landfill from the city and start making all of these defensive mechanisms around them. But it's of course a huge departure from that kind of ultra-modernist understanding of places that have a space but are kind of placeless at the same time and are dimensionless and on this kind of flat horizon between the sky and the lake. So of course the architects weren't super happy with this, but they had to go with it anyways. And what we're standing on right now, the West Island, is kind of a departure from that complete removal of nature as a point where architecture interacts with landscape. So they end up introducing all of these islands, and now you're looking at all this postmodernist kind of weird rock structure and everything, which is again a huge departure from what they were imagining, but they had to do it anyways. So in this case, you're quite literally looking at the kind of abject, the refuse materials from the city becoming defensive measures against the waves. And I don't know how many of you were here last weekend, but there was kind of a thunderstorm going on, and you could very clearly see how you get all these this kind of vicious wave forms and patterns coming towards the islands, and quite literally right after these dikes and the defensive kind of structures, you see perfect calm water. And you go to the ponds closer to the geodesic dome and everything is perfectly calm. So just looking at understanding the hydrosphere very similarly from the desert as a space where you have to conquer and kind of tame in order to be able to create narratives of new worlds is what I'm really interested in this kind of case study. And when you do more kind of a walk around the islands, the first construction phase, and I encourage all of you to take a walk down to the helipad to check this out, was the purchase of 3 kind of obsolete sand carriers in the land, in the lake, that they brought over here. They had dredgers attached to them before, so the idea for them was to essentially clear out space for construction around the beaches and things like that. They purchased these decommissioned vessels and filled them with concrete, and they became the very first kind of defensive measure they had to take in order to stop the waves and start the rest of the construction process. So if you go down right now, you can actually see quite clearly that the entrance to the marina, where all the boats are parked, are still vessels. Like you can actually just look over, and there are these massive kind of obsolete decommissioned vessels that are being used as the first wall against the waves coming forward. So now I've talked about all of this within context of the 80s up to the 90s and understanding how these worlds were kind of constantly being fabricated but also collapsing as they're going. So the idea of the Anthropocene and the post-Anthropocene becomes more of a blurred kind of space where as you're making these worlds, you're also signing off on the ends of a lot of the other ones. And I really want us to keep thinking about any kind of apocalyptic narrative that we hear that often has this transhumanist kind of idea of we either need to upload into the cloud or move to some kind of other level of existence to be able to continue living with more doubt and understanding that a lot of it actually has very grounded time. So I guess I'm just going to continue talking about what happened to all these places in 2003. So going back to all the kind of water infrastructure between Tigris and Euphrates and understanding that it was to a large extent designed as an offensive kind of military tool. In 2003 when the Americans invaded Iraq, the British Army, most of the British squadrons were given the task of securitizing Basra. So that's the city that was specifically the target of any kind of final offensive by flooding from the Iranian part. And because they knew about this, they ended up creating a lot of canals that would potentially neutralize an attack that would involve flooding from the Iranian side. So right now in Basra, there are many different canals that are kind of in the middle of the city. In 2003, when the British came, and this is a narrative that kept coming up for a while, and last week it kind of was all over the news. They had to make sure that there aren't any looters around because there's battles happening and people end up doing things that are considered illegal even within the context of the country's legal system. But at the time, there was the idea is as an incoming army, what you have to do if you find looters is you have to keep them until there's some kind of an official government that could deal with them later on. So what you do is you either arrest them or give them some kind of a notice where they have to come back for the court later on. But in this case, they found one night they were just going around patrolling, and they found this one 15-year-old. His name was Ahmad Jabbar Karim, and they found him under the suspicion of looting. They ended up arresting him, and the idea is because there is no kind of centralized plan for justice on the spot, it really belongs to the soldier. It's kind of up to the soldier to decide what they want to do with whoever they arrest. So they take him, and for punishment, they wanted to scare him essentially. So they took him to one of these canals, and again, he's 15, and forced him to go into the water. And clearly, he couldn't swim, so they essentially forced him to drown himself. And I was just thinking about this narrative because my introduction to these canals and the kind of architecture of offense and defense between the Tigris and Euphrates was when I was 15, taking the preparation for defense class. And then on the other hand, you're looking at this 15-year-old whose last interaction with the canal is because he was forced to drown himself in it. So the world that was supposed to, essentially the world of paranoid kind of introduction of dams and water infrastructure as a form of military tool, when it was being fabricated, it clearly had a vision of how it would end with this final offensive. And for him, it's a very personal kind of interaction that he had with that world. The world was fabricated for him, and he was essentially, to this day, one of the only people who actually lost his life. And, his world came to an end within a conflict that didn't necessarily even have to do a lot with the conflict that informed the creation of these structures in the first place. So I'm just trying to bring this narrative in because it seems like the creation of worlds and their ends are usually understood as this kind of massive apocalyptic thing that happens, but of course there's a kind of very individual human elements to all of these creations. So I'm really interested in that and the way actual people and bodies interact with tools of defense and offense when it comes to water infrastructure. And of course, I just find it really interesting to look back at the Yellow River. And right now, when you go there, it actually feels like a city. Everything is perfect. Everything is like you have people seem to be very happy because they have a steady income. A lot of the resettlement programs kind of evolved into more of a service sector economy. So now a lot of them are working in malls. You know, the classic kind of narrative of how cities are created and then later enter into this realm of hyper-capitalist kind of trade economy. But one thing that remains the same is that it's still a city in the middle of the dunes. It's a city on essentially on an island covered by sand all around it. And all that it needs for its end is someone to decide from the official government to turn the tap off because, I don't know, there is more water needed in Beijing than this town. So it's really interesting to think about worlds as kind of very concrete architectures that are fabricated but also always prone to threats that threaten their existence and really could completely wipe them out within a few days. So just thinking about this town as a reason for stopping the desert and having more efforts focused around it, I find really interesting to think about water as kind of a defense and offense at the same time. And lastly, to think about Ontario Place again, it's, of course, we all know how the whole modernist kind of ideal utopian space failed, and now it's closed because they just couldn't, the maintenance was too high and they just can't keep running a system that has some kind of flaw in its kind of financial thought in the first place. And just being here today and thinking, I mean, it's a beautiful day, it really doesn't feel like the end of any world. But just thinking about how a lot of these ideals are put forward as dimensionless space, as things that could potentially allow us to go beyond our corporeal experience, but actually understanding that because they have such close ties and grounded kind of existences to landscapes and architectures and realities of social economy, they just keep being failures because there is not that many. There are not that many great arguments for being able to transcend from your corporeal kind of existence and closing your ties with landscape. And that goes back, kind of, to bring it back to what Lisa was talking about, it goes without saying that our relationship to landscape really marks how the Anthropocene was defined in the first place, and how when we're thinking about the potential ends of some worlds and the continuous fabrication of new ones, would involve thinking a lot about landscape and understanding that we don't have, at least at this point, we don't have anything else other than the planet that we're on. We have to deal with it in ways that allow us to continue fabricating these worlds that we have for thousands of years, but also think about the kind of consequences of the worlds that we end intentionally, like the offensive measures in Tigris and Euphrates, the Karun Dam, or the Yellow River in this town that was created but completely on the verge of being disintegrated if anyone makes a decision. And here, just a quick revival of this modernist failure and understanding it's within the relationship to postmodernist islands that were not even kind of part of it in the first place. So I feel like that kind of concludes what I wanted to talk to you about, and I know it's been about 45 minutes, so I don't want to keep you waiting too long. But if you have any other narratives or like examples that you're interested in when it comes to water infrastructure, I'd be more than happy to hear them and share them with them. Or if you have questions, I'd be more than happy to take them.
Have you been to any of the islands that have disappeared? Like, is it an actual in the Australian Sea?
Which
So there are several islands that have threatened with complete nations disappearing.
Exactly, yeah.
Because of the rising sea level. Have you studied any of those?
I haven't studied any of those, but I do find them very interesting because constantly as these islands are being threatened to disappear completely, there are other islands that are artificially being built in South China Sea, for example. You have these dredgers coming forward, making artificial islands, knowing that the sea levels are going to come up, so they're going to have to grow these islands almost like crystals that have to continue to be built in order to survive. And then on the other hand, you have whole nation states, like actual sovereignties that are threatened by the raising of the water. And I do find that interesting because when you want to think about the world as a post kind of Anthropocene, what happens to us after we've kind of messed up the world so much that we can't quite save it anymore. You have two narratives. One of them is the sea levels rising so much that you're losing land, and then you also have this almost abstract way of looking at the sea as the desert expanding from within the land. So by 2050, they're saying the sub-Saharan countries and China and Iran and a lot of Middle Eastern countries are going to be most kind of seriously hit by massive desertification, which essentially turns good land that could be worked on to kind of wasteland zones where you can't really have any kind of interaction with it. So it's like from the outside, the water is encroaching, and then from within, the desert is expanding and encroaching the cities. So I guess we're going to be left with this kind of small strip of whatever urban fabric we're going to be left with. But yeah, I just find that really interesting. As these islands are disappearing, new ones are being constructed. So this kind of constant back and forth between fabrication and disintegration, it's almost integral to the way we understand the world.
Do you have any understanding or insight into this area is going to dissolve, or I mean, how do you see it progressing? What do you see as the narrative of this area from now?
This very area.
Yeah.
Well, right now, most of the things that I know is things that are on the news and everyone else knows, and it just seems like they just want to keep pouring money into it to use it as a theme park that could potentially return some revenues. And I don't know, it seems like, of course, the city of Toronto is used to expand horizontally a lot more, and nowadays it's going up vertically. So I'm just interested in whether there would be a shift in urbanist thought in Toronto, or they would start thinking about the hydrosphere again as something to conquer, introduce new utopias onto. So I'm not sure what's exactly going to happen to this place. Probably just going to continue as some kind of a modernist spectacle. And right now it's kind of being framed more of a nostalgia modernist spectacle. So I just feel like it's going to continue going that way. And I don't know, maybe one day it's going to be a museum of modernist ideals or something.
I mean, riffing off of your guys' conversations, the thought of, there was the Terraform One exhibition at Onsite Gallery that devised a sort of a model of Red Hook, that instead of stopping the water, it brought it in and absorbed it and used it. Because it was kind of easier in a way to divert and use than try to stop and hold at bay. I mean, it'd be interesting to think of this space as some kind of lab where they could have things like this, but people could also do landscape and experiments on different ways to deal with the rising water.
And what's really interesting about that kind of way of thinking about space creation is that for thousands of years, our civilizations have been focused on the identification of a threat and then making sure that they design for its postponing. So the idea that they use is actually a term they use in military language, that you identify a threat and then try to put so many layers of defense in front of it until you postpone its arrival. You know that it's inevitable that it will come, but what you want to do is make sure that it comes the latest possible moment. And it's interesting that this shift in landscape architecture and architectural kind of urban planning altogether is that they're saying we should keep identifying these threats because it's kind of essential for our survival, but then we should also embrace them. We should design for their arrival as opposed to making sure that you have this kind of dated idea of just setting up barricades in front of them so they don't arrive later, but just embrace it and start designing for that kind of context. And Terraform One is, of course, kind of a leading institution where they think about these things more on abstract levels, but of course turning that into concretized kind of projects involves a lot of interdisciplinary collaborations with engineers and philosophers and poets and anyone who can really help embrace the arrival of projects. Kind of try to imagine and theorize about
that. So if you are going to, or you were describing the Anthropocene as the pillar of modernism, then where do you see let's say, sustainable architecture and green design in terms of urban benefit as we're moving towards this like post-Anthropocene?
I mean, the term post-Anthropocene is just really interesting because I feel like what it's really saying is an Anthropocene on the verge of collapse. It's not quite. It's like we've done our activities, the Homo sapiens activities, have influenced the landscape so much that continuing doing that would just allow it to collapse. So I feel like sustainable design and these approaches are the last kind of holding grounds of making sure that we can continue to design in this way, but to but they still have this kind of paranoid ideology embedded in them, where the threat is coming and all we have to do is make sure that we kind of reduce our impact on the landscape so it comes later. Because at this point we know it's coming, but there's usually all these there's another way of thinking about it as something that it's coming and all we have to do is just embrace it and like rethink how we
But what about those like bio-architectures? Let's say like living green wall,
mushrooms and
right? So they just say like, you put up a wall and we let it deteriorate and let the nature take over, and in turn just form the architecture that would allow like better installations and what control that any technology could do. So like in the way they tend like give up in order to be able to be safe.
No, totally, and I feel like that does decenter the role of the human as the ultimate kind of creator of spaces. So, as opposed to having this Anthropocene, you're opening it up for kind of multi-natural ways of seeing the expansion of civilization, which I find really interesting. But I don't know, I just find the term Anthropocene and then putting it within the context of post-Anthropocenes brings to mind all these transhumanist kind of ideologies where you're thinking about kind of transcending your corporeal experience and then designing in a way that would allow for almost for worlds to create themselves, which is really interesting also. It's kind of a dispute.
I'm really interested from the shift of having a conversation with plants and animals as weighted as heavily as humans. And it's just a really hard conceptual thing to do. It's been a long process, and I'm not really there yet, but I think that's what you were starting to touch on in a way of like, what is the plant telling us we need, and how did the plants vote? How did they become part of democracy, or how does an animal speak to a human, and how do we decide what speaking is, or how do we at least shift our conceptual language to at least open up a tiny bit to try to listen to different.
And that, sorry, I'm just going to say something real quick, and that involves kind of radically rethinking objectivity and subjectivities, because then you're assigning subjectivities to landscapes and thinking about it as this kind of multinodal, almost multinatural way of thinking about creation, which I find a very difficult but necessary task if you're thinking about finally transcending the Anthropocene, thinking what goes on here.
Well, I was just in response to what you said about the living laws, and like those things, like they're still very highly controlled areas. So like I don't know if you can exactly break down that barrier between like pure nature, I guess you could say, and human intervention with those structures, because they are. I mean, humans are still choosing the plants that they find most appropriate. They're still cultivating those areas. They're still keeping them. From what I understand of like the concept of a living wall or living roof or whatever. So I'm not sure if I see that as being. I just
It's a
want to
highly
say that.
engineered response,
Yeah,
and
it's
what's
highly,
happening?
yeah.
Yeah, and what's happening in around the Gobi Desert is exactly that. They have millions of trees planted as a wall. Essentially, what they're doing is stop planting a whole wall of natural living elements around the desert to stop it. But then there's all these other kind of engineering aspects to it, because first, you have to choose exactly what vegetation you're introducing, and then before that, you have to introduce all these architectures like wind barriers, windbreakers, and like drying hay grids to stabilize the soil before you even introduce all this vegetation. So I feel like it's still a very kind of engineered approach, and not that there's anything wrong with that approach of creation, but I just find that necessary to acknowledge and start talking about. Any other thoughts?
Thank you so much. I mean, actually, did I jump into? Thank you so much.
Yeah, and I'll be around.